Hey, Kristen, SuperCrip Milefchik here. My guest today is a trailblazer in the disability community. She founded Detroit Disability Power, a nonprofit organization that does activism work and provides information and resources to members of the disability community and their families to be able to be civically active, have better quality of life, be the best self-advocates they can be, and to be fully integrated with their surrounding communities. Please welcome Dessa Cosma. All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Dessa. And Dessa, it is Cosma is how you pronounce your last name, right?
Yes, Cosma.
Okay. Dessa Cosma. And Dessa, before we get into the questions about Detroit Disability Power and everything like that, I wanted to first ask a little bit about your personal background, like where you're originally from, the journey leading up to being in Detroit and leading Detroit Disability Power.
Sure. Well, originally I'm from New Orleans, and I grew up kind of splitting my time between New Orleans and Augusta, Georgia. My parents were divorced, and so I'm a Southerner, even though I don't really sound like it. And, I really actually think so much about my childhood is exactly why I'm an organizer today. I grew up as a young woman with a disability, low income, in a place that was very culturally different than my family. So Georgia is very conservative, very kind of religious, and my family is not Christian, is very progressive, politically, had kind of different values than a lot of the folks around us. And so I learned at a very young age that, well, two important things. One, that the world wasn't necessarily built for everyone to succeed. And that became clear to me in a real physical sense as a wheelchair user as a child. I never went to accessible schools until I was in high school. So much of the world around me was inaccessible to me just physically. And although we made it work, my parents were really great at adapting and improvising. And also as a low income person, it was just, clear to me, like, why does my mom have 3 jobs and we still are poor, right? Like, it just seemed pretty obvious that things weren't set up for everyone to succeed.
Yeah.
And then I think the other really important thing about being a kid in that situation is I realized that I could be quiet and just let people assume that I was like them, or that I had the same beliefs, or that I thought everything around us was okay. Or I could, be kind of the odd one out and speak my mind and be honest and authentic about what I saw going on and what I thought. And I chose the latter, and maybe not surprisingly, and really gave me lots of good practice as a young person, standing up for what I believe in and standing up for myself. And so that definitely influenced my politics and my activism as an adult.
Awesome. Yeah, and when I was younger, I don't think I knew that I didn't um, agree with a lot of the views of some of the people that are around me, because I grew up in pretty conservative areas too. Just recently, just a little over, it's been almost 2 years now that I've been living in Detroit. But prior to that, I've lived in some pretty conservative suburban kind of areas. And I knew that I didn't agree or think the same way as a lot of people around me, but I didn't understand how I fit into that whole equation until I got a little bit older, and I was exposed to more people like me with
Mm,
disabilities. And then hearing other people's stories and being able to relate to them is what brought out that side of me, more. So
definitely.
could you give a little bit of background about what your disability is for my viewers?
Sure, yeah. So I was born without femurs or knees, so I'm very short. My upper body is average size, but I'm about 3.5 feet tall, and I can walk, but just not very far. So I use a wheelchair primarily when I'm out and about. So I'm both a little person and a wheelchair user.
Okay, all right.
Mm.
Now, when it comes to starting Detroit Disability Power, how did the idea for that originally occur, and what went into organizing that and making it happen?
So, I have been really fortunate to work in social justice my entire adult life. When I went off to college, I studied women's studies and anthropology and international relations, none of which are known for creating good job opportunities, but all of which were things I really loved and found fascinating. And I spent a lot of time in college organizing. I think as much time as I spent in academics, I spent, planning protests and marches and organizing other students. And
Love
I
it.
found that that's where my passion was, and it was something I was good at. And so, and it was something that made me feel good. Like I could look around and say, like, wow, the world has got a long way to go, but I can do something about it and I can make it better. And so, after that, I started getting professional jobs as an organizer, and I loved that work. I found it so meaningful. I met the most amazing people. I felt really rewarded, and it was really in line with my values. And I started realizing after a few years of doing that professionally, and at this point, I had graduated school and I had moved up to Detroit. I started realizing, like, wow, I'm the only obviously disabled person around pretty much all the time. I'm in these big meetings of organizers from all these different organizations working on, environmental justice and LGBTQ justice and gender justice and, you name it. And there was nobody there representing disability community, hardly ever. There was nobody there that was visibly disabled besides myself,
Mhm.
and I was kind of there on behalf of whatever organization I was working for. So I was there primarily to talk about reproductive rights or racial justice or economic justice. And of course, my experiences as a disabled woman impact my views on that. you
Mhm.
know it's all very interconnected, but I started feeling kind of lonely and like, where are my folks, and why is this kind of like brilliant group of people I'm being able to do this work with not disturbed that disability isn't a part of the conversation. Like, I started feeling really disturbed.
Yeah, and that intersectionality of disability is something that I'm constantly trying to emphasize for people. Um, that, we're part of every other marginalized community. And
Yeah,
if we come together and work together across those lines of differences, we're going to have more success and, making a stronger community for everybody. Um,
totally.
yeah, and I feel like people with disabilities have the power to help bridge that gap between different marginalized populations because we're in all of them and we're a part.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think not only are we in every other group, any single person can join our group at any moment.
Mhm.
And so it's a real dynamic identity. Some identities are more static and some are more dynamic. Disability tends to be a really dynamic, changing, evolving identity for people,
Mhm.
and experience for people. And so it really does lend itself to cross movement work, cross community solidarity, and exactly to your point, we can help bridge a gap. And I also think it takes real intentionality in multiple ways. It takes intentionality for non-disabled social justice people to open up their disability consciousness, to learn, to be intentional around access and inclusion, and understanding that disability is also a political identity for many of us. And it also takes intentionality for disabled people to really like work on our issues around race and class and gender,
Yes.
and to get really serious about, you know, really having an anti-racist politic in addition or intermingled with our disability consciousness, and not seeing that as a competition to us as disabled people.
Yeah, and I've seen progress in that area, but I also still see people with specific types of disabilities sometimes not counting people with other types of disabilities and everything as necessarily disabled because it doesn't look like they.
Yeah.
And for the same reason as, you know, not looking at the social issues that affect people with different races and genders and all of that kind of stuff, is the same kind of problem. Like, we can't move ahead, move forward until we recognize that we have the same goals.
Right.
If we don't work together, we're not going to move. So,
Right. And structural oppression has to be dismantled in all of its forms for it to actually be dismantled. Like, we can't just dismantle ableism and not work on racism, because then what about all the disabled people of color, right?
yeah,
And we can't just work on racism and not ableism, again, because what about all the disabled people of color,
yeah,
right? And so these interlocking systems of oppression, I really believe, have to be you know, attacked head on from all angles,
yeah.
and in a way that's strategic across communities.
Yeah. And you know, I was looking at the website, the Detroit Disability Power website, and looking at all the events. It's incredible, everything that you guys have done. And you know, the Pride March that you guys did parade, and the Black Disabled Lives Matter. That one was really cool to me because I am also constantly trying to raise awareness about how 50% of the people that are killed by police are disabled, and that you're more likely to be killed by police if you're disabled and Black, and or disabled and LGBTQ. And if you are all three, then you know that's compounded. You know, those different marginalized identities compound the risk. But I don't think a lot of people realize, you know, what a proportion of people that are killed by the police are disabled, and that's huge. And that right there would be a reason for, you know, other communities to come together and participate. So that being said, there's so much work that you guys have done and have covered that's going to be difficult to go through all of it. But definitely the most recent thing, and a very, very big deal on a national scale, is how DDP helped make Detroit one of the first cities in the nation to prioritize the COVID-19 vaccination for people with disabilities. And I wanted to ask you first, in your own words, why that's so important, or that's so significant.
Well, one simple way to answer that question is that it's important and significant because people with disabilities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and the ability to get in line and get a vaccine is literally saving lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, in the less than 3 weeks that people with disabilities, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities specifically, in Detroit have been able to get vaccinated, more than 700 of us have. And that's something that we're tremendously proud of. And also, it's a drop in the bucket of the disability population here in Detroit, right? There's 126,000 of us. So, not everyone that probably needs a vaccine knows that they can get it yet, or has, made the phone call to sign up. And I hope that more and more people do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important because it can save lives. It's also important because the disability community in general is neglected
Yeah.
pretty constantly and not at decision-making tables where we really need to be to influence policy decisions. And so for this campaign, we, at Detroit Disability Power, we had been working on COVID stuff since last March. I mean, as soon as the pandemic started, we sprung into action because we knew that our folks would be left out in really significant ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we, I can talk about the things we've done in the last year for a long time, but we were really, one of the things that we were really concerned about and had every reason to be concerned about was medical rationing. And so when there's not enough ventilators or enough hospital beds, medical personnel have to make difficult decisions about who gets treatment. And because of ableism and bias against disabled people, particularly in medical establishments, we know that that means our folks get deprioritized. There's this kind of current paradigm that you save the people who are the healthiest and the youngest. And it's a really problematic assumption of value.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were pushing really hard on that for a lot of 2020. And we pushed on a lot of other things in 2020 to try to make sure that our folks weren't left out of the emergency response. And when the new year rolled around and vaccines started becoming available, and data also started coming out about the disparate impact of COVID on people with disabilities, and that data was shocking. The data was actually jaw-dropping, right? Like people with Down syndrome, for example, are 10 times more likely to die from COVID than non-disabled people. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities, 3 times more likely to die. People with schizophrenia, 3 times more likely to die. I could keep going with these really terrible numbers. And there was no signal from our state or city government that those numbers meant anything to them. There
Yeah.
was no action that they took that let us know that they saw the numbers or cared. And so we decided to, put it in their face very plainly and say, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
Oh, here, we have an idea. This is what you should do about it. So we ran a campaign and we bombarded the mayor's office with phone calls and emails from Detroiters with disabilities and our allies saying, hey, let us get the vaccine.
Yeah.
And it worked. That's the way organizing should work. It was beautiful.
Yes, it is beautiful. And like as a Detroiter and somebody with a developmental disability, my disability, the most likely cause of death for somebody with SMA is a respiratory infection or complications. And I not only have that, but I also have diabetes type 1, juvenile diabetes. And so I was pretty surprised when the vaccination rollout was, publicized and everything, that we were like not until like the 4th group that was supposed to get it. And I understood, that we have to prioritize also elderly and frontline workers and so forth. That makes absolute sense also. But I also didn't understand the difference between senior and a person with a developmental disability or
Right.
intellectual disability and so forth. So yeah, it was very, very exciting to see that you accomplished that. Do you know which other states are doing this, or are they doing it to not as large of an extent as Detroit is doing it? Because I know Detroit is also, you have ADHD
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
that list, and that was even like I had not thought about some of the reasons why they might be more at risk and everything. When I read the research, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense.
Right.
But it was like nobody was looking into these things.
Yeah.
And so that was very impressive. But do you know if any other states or cities are doing the same?
So yes, and it's changing regularly. So I'm not going to have an exhaustive list off the top of my head, but there's a few things there that you just said that I'd really like to expound upon a little bit.
Yeah.
And one is that we had in our organizing, we had really lobbied for a broad definition of disability because we knew if the definition was too narrow, if the mayor were to pick like a couple of diagnoses, that too many people would be left out, right? Like nobody has my diagnoses,
Yeah.
right? Not a ton of people have your diagnoses compared to some other ones, right? So like when we only think about disability as like very specific medical terminology and diagnoses, we end up kind of erasing some of the other factors that ableism in our lives that actually make us more susceptible. And so had the mayor just said, you know, cerebral palsy and this and this and this, right? That would have been a problem because a lot of people wouldn't have been eligible. But by defining it more broadly as intellectual and developmental disabilities, which does not include everyone, I think it could be broader. I think it should be broader. But that was broad enough that it captured a lot of people, and that was positive. I think, though, that one thing we've been trying to just shout from the rooftops, to your point about ADHD, is because people were surprised. People were like, really, ADHD? Like, what are you doing here? We got like elders that haven't been vaccinated yet. You guys are like out of your mind, right? Well, in actuality, it's not just our bodies that make us more susceptible to COVID,
It's our minds.
right?
Yeah.
It's also the environment around us,
Yeah.
right? So all of the things that make any marginalized group more susceptible to a disparate health impact, right? And we saw this immediately and starkly with the African American community, particularly in Detroit, that it's not like African Americans' bodies are more susceptible to COVID, but generations of racism, high rates of poverty, lack of access to healthcare, discrimination in healthcare, those are the reasons that those communities had higher COVID death rates.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those things also apply to disability communities, and particularly apply to disability communities of color.
Yes.
So, you know, as Dessa, my body isn't more susceptible to COVID. My disability doesn't have anything to do with my pulmonary system or my respiratory system, right? But because I'm a little person and because I'm a wheelchair user, I need more help than other people with things. So socially distancing is difficult.
Yep.
I have to touch a lot of things because I can't reach things at the grocery store or wherever I'm going, right? I can drive, but a lot of people can't drive, so they have to take public transit. Yep. There's all these like environmental, structural reasons, and those things matter. I don't know if I could say as much as the physical, biological things, but they add up together to be a really significant thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an excellent, excellent point. And I'm so glad that you were able to explain that for people that are going to be watching this, because I know that's got to be happening for a lot of people. I just don't like, I have caregivers, and I had to hire new caregivers during the pandemic. And so I had a Zoom interviews, and so far, during the time that they've been working for me, I have not ever seen their face. I mean, they have
right.
You know, all the time, and gloves and washing their hands, you know, in between, and all of that kind of stuff. And they understand how incredibly important it is for me. But it's still, even with all of those precautions in place, it's still very, very scary. And, you know, and I can't drive myself either. And so, you know, like all of those things combined, even without the biological factors that I have, would still put me at greater risk.
Right.
So yeah, that makes absolutely perfect sense. And I also, this is getting into a philosophical kind of part of all of this, but I know that you will probably understand where I'm coming from. You were talking about early on during the pandemic, like worrying about medical decisions, disregarding people with disabilities. And I know there were some news stories about one man that died in Texas. You're familiar with the one I'm talking about? Yeah. Because they made a quality of life decision. And that's another thing that I bring up a lot when I'm talking to people in interviews and so forth, is that quality of life is a very relative thing.
Yep.
From the outside looking in, you may see this person as suffering and, oh, I'm so happy that, I don't have to deal with the struggles that they have to deal with and all of that. But at the same time, me and the things that are struggles to other people are also just my existence and how I've always operated. But it does not impact my ability, or not my ability, my desire to want to live the fullest and happiest and,
Right.
most productive, independent life possible.
Right.
And I think it's really, really difficult for people to wrap their head around the fact that people can have what seems like a miserable existence from their point of view.
Right.
But it may not be that for them.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
There are people that are a lot more from what other people would, consider disabled than even I am. And they still, live great lives because what they find happiness in, it looks different than what somebody else finds happiness in. And I feel like there's got to be a cultural shift, a perspective shift around that and what quality of life actually means. Because so many things that aren't supposed to be based on quality of life for decision making still are. That's really what it boils down to.
For sure. Yeah, amen. I mean, the things you're talking about are the things I think about all day. And Michael Hicksman was the man in Texas, 46-year-old African-American quadriplegic man, father of 5, I believe, happily married. No one asked his wife if they could take him off the machines. Nobody got his consent.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody assumed that his life was equally as valuable as anyone else's because he was quadriplegic. And that is bias in a very kind of clearly deadly way. But I think it happens a million times every day in less clearly deadly, but also very deadly ways. And until we start having that culture shift that you're talking about, and really unpacking and acknowledging and rectifying the way that ableism is showing up in every part of our society,
yes,
we're not gonna get where we need to be. And I think, for one thing, people who are not disabled, they don't necessarily know enough about our lives to know how we adapt and cope. And so, as you said, from their vantage point, it looks really hard and really sad or really tragic or whatever kind of stereotype they may have. And let's be real, it is hard to be disabled, right? It's hard, but it's, for me, and this is not true of everyone, right? I think it's disability specific in some ways, but I will say that my belief is that for many of us, much of the challenge is actually other people.
Yes.
And the built environment. So if other people could get it together and not be jerks, right? And not have low expectations of us and treat us like full human beings. Yeah. I mean, that would be the biggest improvement that disabled people could get. And if we started building everything to actually work for people with a variety of disabilities, it wouldn't be so hard for us to find a place to live, or so hard for us to get a job or to go to school. So
Mhm.
those structural things, all of that can be changed. There's just no, it's just a matter of political will.
Mhm.
There's no reason we can't build everything to be accessible, except for that people who make decisions don't think it's important.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's very real challenges, like physical pain, anguish, grief, isolation. Like, these are real challenges for us and people in our community. And that's legit. And then there's also all this other stuff that compounds that about our culture and our society that doesn't have to be the way that it is.
Mhm. I absolutely agree. Yeah, the social model of disability definitely is the one that I follow, not the medical model. Because I can tell you, based on my experiences in my life, all the different times that if something had been adjusted in the environment that I have to live in, how much easier and more fulfilling life would be for me. And still to this day, obviously, the amount of people with disabilities that are still forced to live in nursing homes, uh,
Yeah.
this has been probably my biggest policy platform position I've been trying to push on. And this last year, with COVID and everything and the devastation,
Right.
nursing homes and stuff, and people are still ignoring it. And it seems like that is entirely based on the fact that people don't understand that people with disabilities aren't just like ready to give up and die. They have
Right.
lives.
Right. 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 And on that note, Kristen, like, one of the things that's been uh, challenging to convey during our organizing around the COVID response is that, so the state of Michigan and most states are not tracking the disability status of COVID patients.
Mhm.
And this is a problem, because we can't tell you how many disabled people in Michigan have died from COVID. So we know that, over 15,000 people in our state have died in the last year from COVID. And we can tell you how many of them were women. We can tell you what race they were. We can tell you how old they were. But we can't tell you if they were disabled or not. And there's, one reason that it's really important to know that is so that we can look at the data and design interventions,
Mhm.
right? Like, if we were to be able to say, this percentage of people that died had intellectual disabilities, we would know, okay, we really gotta design interventions for people in this way, right?
Mhm.
Um, but we're not collecting that data, right? And so the data that we do have that came out in the last few months is not specifically for Michigan, but it's comparable, right? Like, there's no reason to believe what happened kind of more nationally isn't the case here. So we have to push for the same solutions as if the data was from Michigan. What we have learned in the last month, which is so disturbing and gets to your point about nursing homes, is that in the UK, 60% of people who have died have been disabled people. And we know that because they track the data from the beginning.
I just got like the bad kind of chills.
Me too. Yeah, I definitely, it's so heartbreaking
Yeah.
to know that, right? And I think one of the things that reminds us is that there's not a separation necessarily between age and disability. So we know that elders are dying at high ratios. We know that nursing homes were particularly hard hit. But a lot of the people that live in nursing homes are disabled people, whether they're 35 or 75. They
Hmm.
could be living in a nursing home. And so those are our community members. And they're getting counted as older people, but they're not getting counted as disabled people.
Right.
So my fear is that when this all shakes out and we look back, we'll realize that 60% of the people that died in this country were disabled people, but nobody thought maybe we should track this. Maybe these people matter enough to count. And we're not going to learn all the lessons that we could learn from having gone through this, global scale
Yeah.
pandemic.
And it's absolutely, one of the most frustrating things I have ever been through in my entire life, to hear the number of people that say that, well, a lot of these COVID deaths that are being counted as COVID deaths aren't really COVID deaths because that person was already disabled. And, and I keep saying, I've had muscular dystrophy my whole life. I've had type 1 diabetes since I was 6 years old. They aren't killing me.
Right.
Not killing me. And no, just because I have these things, if I got COVID and I died, it would be COVID that killed me.
Right.
These other things.
Right.
And yes, the thing about, younger people living in nursing homes too, that's a huge thing to me. I actually worked in a nursing home for a little bit as an intern. I was volunteering mostly when I worked there. But I met young people in this nursing home, and they hated it there. And they didn't have the option of not being there because they didn't have enough in-home support for their needs. And it's the biggest travesty in the world to me, not just because people, generally have a shortened lifespan when they live in these places, but they're forced to give up their autonomy and their self-determination and their identity when they're living in these places. And it's the worst kind of suffering I can really imagine. I've already told my parents, if I ever get to a point where I can't get enough help to live, I'd rather die than be in one of these places. So, very big issue, very important. And I know we're both getting emotional.
Thanks for making me cry.
Sorry.
No, I mean it's cry-worthy, and like it's cry-worthy, and it's also absolutely infuriating. It is infuriating that this is happening, and I me and my team at DDP, we talk on a regular basis about, like, we know we're right about these things. And in the case of the current COVID situation, we have the data to prove that we're right? A lot of times we know we're right experientially, by having relationships with people, by like having an understanding of the way that ableism works. Like, we know we're right. But now we know we're right, and we have the numbers, and still people aren't moving to act for the most part. We still can't get the state to do the right thing. We still can't get the county governments to do the right thing. And we have showed them the data. We've had conversations with them about the data. And we see that they're mostly like moved by it. Like, they're like, wow, I didn't know this. But then they don't do the next thing, which is to change the policy. So to know and to not act seems, it's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it is mind-boggling. And you wonder if how many of these people that are in positions of power that make these decisions, if they had somebody that they loved that needed this vaccine, would it change? It shouldn't require that, though.
Right.
It's not what justice is, that you have to be directly impacted yourself to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I get really tired of overall with.
Yeah. All sorts of problems right now, right?
If it doesn't impact me, then I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah.
So
it's unconscionable.
Yeah. So, I mean, thank goodness for you and the work that TDP is doing, because we do still have a long, long way to go. But
well, I will say we're not doing it alone. So there's a lot of disability organizations in Michigan and across the country, a lot of activists, a lot of allies. I mean, we need more all the time. um, but that's the thing about organizing that I love so much, is that it's people powered. It's a broad collective of people pushing for what's right, and that kind of solidarity and those relationships make all the hard work and make the frequent losses bearable, and allows us to collectively come up with something that's better than what we have, because 10,000 minds are definitely better than one or two calling all the shots.
Yes.
So it has to be collective.
Yeah. And I'm going to show in the video description the link for the campaign, the
Thank you.
County campaign that you're doing. Any words of advice for people not in Michigan or in other areas that are pushing for these same things, to the activists out there? Any words of advice that you can give them on what you would do? I mean, is apart from what we already know that you did, or that DDP did and other organizations that were involved, and can you give any other advice?
Yeah. I mean, for me, having disability community is really important. Having other people that know what it's like to live in this world as a disabled person, and be able to have those relationships really bolster bolster me and bolster the work. I think that's critical, and that can be hard to find, right? So I'm not taking it for granted that those are often relationships that have to be found and cultivated, but very important. And I think also, a lot of times stuff starts with a small seed or a small idea, and writing an elected official, figure out who, where you are, is determining the vaccine strategy. Is it a health department? Is it a city council? Is it a governor? Like, who is it? And get in touch with them and share your story. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. It just has to be authentic. And it has to be clear, and tell them what you want them to do. Try to get a meeting with them. I mean, you might not be able to get a meeting with them, but you might. It's like the more people you ask to get a meeting with, the more doors you knock on, the more that somebody's going to open one. And so, our strategy in this campaign has been to knock on every door. And once we go through all the doors once knocking, we come back and we knock louder the second time, and we have like 50 people with us the second time. And sometimes the doors don't ever open, but some of the doors that open help you get the other doors to open. And so I think just like the persistence of that, and the remember, there are moments in this campaign, again, where our team has had to check in with ourselves and been like, so we know we're right, but the powers that be are acting like we have three heads, right? The powers that be are looking at us like, huh? Or like totally ignoring us, right? And it feels like gaslighting. It feels like it's essentially being told, like, the thing you're experiencing isn't real. The fear you have is just in your head, right? And the whole thing that you're talking about is like not real. That's gaslighting. And we've really, at moments, had to take a step back as a team and like take a few deep breaths before we go back out there, because that constant gaslighting is so harmful. And so I think like knocking on all the doors, building community, but also like remembering like you are worth it, right? Like we are worth saving, even if other people don't understand that yet.
Yeah.
And staying really grounded in that.
That you just gave me goosebumps. Saying that, I think that really summarizes the whole point. of doing what you do, doing what I do, is recognizing that we're worth it, no matter how many other people might not see it. You have to keep that in your head constantly. Um, but it's been really fun. It has been about 45 minutes, so I suppose I should probably let you go because you are probably the busiest person right now with all the work that you're doing, but I will provide that link in the description. And I also have been doing some work to really try to spread the word about the Disability Integration Act, which, as you know,
Mhm.
affects the whole nursing home care
Yes.
dilemma. So I know that you work on all of those things as well. But I'm going to continue bringing it up as often as possible when I make these videos.
Good.
So yeah, and I'm trying to get up as more and more other people that are involved in other types of activism, not just the disability community activism, to get involved with that because, like, as we were saying, the more people from different communities that are involved, the more successful we'll be. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Kristen.
You're very welcome. It's my honor. And when this is posted, I will send you the link to it. And also, I will be publishing it on my website as
Awesome.
everybody. And I might even, for this one, do an accompanying article with some of the other more details about around the research and everything like that. I've actually already written one about how Detroit was the first, leading the COVID, but even one more in depth about some of the things that we covered here today. So
Great. Yeah, keep me posted. I'd love to read that.
I will.
Thank you, Kristen.
And I hope that we get to talk again soon. It's always
too.
see you.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.